Welcome to Adventures in Accessibility, a podcast that explores the far reaches of disability, access, and inclusion, with your host, Emily Schumann.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Adventures in Accessibility. Today's guest is Keri Gray. As a child, Keri was diagnosed with bone cancer, which resulted in an amputated leg. Keri is the CEO and founder of the Keri Gray Group, which centers on exploring the intersections of race, gender, and disability across the workplace. As a consultant, speaker, and facilitator, she works with companies and organizations so they're prepared to leverage intersectionality as an organizational practice. Keri is also the founder and executive director of the National Alliance of Multicultural Disabled Advocates, which is a network of organizers across the country who invest in the livelihood and leadership of Black and Brown people with disabilities. Through her various roles, Keri has recruited approximately 4,000 professionals for over 100 organizations and Fortune 500 companies. She has also designed and managed programs for over 1,000 professionals that have helped participants secure competitive employment, identify transferable skills, build an influential network, and gain notable opportunities. All right. Well, hi, Keri. Thank you so much for being our guest today. We're so honored to have you on Adventures in Accessibility.
Yes, thanks for having me. I can't wait to hop into our conversation today.
Great. Well, some of our listeners might not be familiar with you and your work. So could you please just tell us about yourself?
For sure. So Keri Gray, she, her. I am a Black woman, currently wearing these big old glasses, brown head wrap, white tee with a gray sweater, and I identify as a Black woman with disabilities. I've been a person for a very long time who has always believed in the inclusion of all people across our society. And I think it's no secret that there are those of us that are underrepresented, that are facing disparities in a multitude of industries. And I became very passionate and focused on how do we close those disparities? How do we gain access? How do we gain influence, power, opportunities, all of those different things? And particularly looking at it from an intersectional lens is a lot of what my work is about. So being able to say, you know, as a person with a disability who's also Black, who's also a woman, how will we ensure that we're talking about the variety of different ways in which people experience discrimination and violence, but mostly also how are we transforming our organizational cultures and our systems so that people are included? And so I do a lot of work to get people to understand, you know, what are these disparities? What are the things that are causing folks to experience, different forms of discriminations, and what does it look like for us to be more inclusive? So that's a little bit about my work and my background.
Thank you. Would you be comfortable sharing a little bit more about your disability specifically with our listeners?
Sure. So I'm a cancer survivor. I got diagnosed with bone cancer when I was very young in elementary school. And after going through chemo and, you know, just all of those different things, I ended up getting an amputation. So I have a prosthetic on my right leg. I have hearing loss also due to chemotherapy. And those have been, I think, the two main aspects that got me to, be a person with a disability. I will note that I think something that can be pretty common in our community is that even though I've had my disability since I was young, it wasn't until I was in college that I began to really, openly identify as a person with a disability and really explore what does that mean to me socially? What does that mean to me, beyond the medical aspects of, this is the reality that I live physically, but like there's so many other things that get embedded in that experience. And so I found that that level of like, if I can say love, if I can use words like love and advocacy for myself as a person with a disability, had to be the foundation of me saying this is what I need. This is, this is what access looks like to me. This is how I'm navigating life. Like, I definitely can describe, some of the things that go on with me physically, but I think a lot of my journey has been about the social aspect of, being aware of who I am and recognizing, things in society and my environments that need to shift.
And so, as you mentioned, a lot of your work centers around the intersections of disability, race, gender, and more. So, I'd love to hear you talk more about, kind of from your point of view, why that work is so important.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly important because I think history has just shown us that we tend to fall into these hierarchies of who gets priority in terms of access. We hear that a lot in the disability community in terms of hierarchy of disability and more attention. We go through phases like there's times where people with physical disabilities get most attention, and what type of physical disability, and we'll shift to focus on mental health and all of these different things. And that same thing happens on an even broader scale. Whereas, someone who, as I mentioned earlier, is a Black disabled woman, oftentimes you can be put in situations to pick and choose which side of yourself deserves access. Are we fighting for voting rights because your experiences as a Black person? Or are we fighting for voting rights because of your experiences as a person with a disability? Literally, those questions come up where people want you to pick and choose and stay in that lane of what side of yourself deserves the most attention and rights. And what we're seeing happening in, I think, advocacy spaces today is folks rejecting that hierarchy and saying, no, there might be moments and times where I'm pointing out what's happened in each one of these areas, but I'm not going to leave any aspect of myself behind. And so that is something that has been incredibly important and necessary, I think, for my existence. But also, I think something that is very important to a lot of people, where we're having to say, like, I need everybody to get access and not just some of us.
Yeah, that actually leads nicely into my next question, which is kind of talking about language. And something that comes up a lot in the disability world, as you know, is the power of language. And, we talk a lot about offensive and oppressive disability terminology, person first language versus identity first language, the euphemism treadmill, all those types of things. So I was wondering what your take on language is from your sort of intersectional perspective, and do those ever conflict with each other? For example, I was thinking, you really would never hear somebody say a person with Blackness or a person with womanhood, right? But you do hear a person with a disability. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I really appreciate this question because it's something that can be very intimidating, I think, to a lot of people and a lot of places, particularly in today's time where the social and political implications of our identity is like tricky. And it's one of those things where it's challenging because I think that we are oftentimes trying to have a really like intentional, deeply rooted conversation around things such as inclusion, things such as, harm, such as shifting. Like, these are very meaningful things that we're attempting to figure out and we're attempting to do work around. However, before we can even get to the meat of the conversation, we first have to have an introduction. And so it's like, how do I say, how do I acknowledge if I'm in a room full of all these different diverse types of people and I don't know yet how they personally identify?
Mhm.
How do we connect in a way that doesn't turn awkward really quickly? And awkward could honestly be a low level word because it's sensitive, right? Like,
Right.
we're in a place and time where it's not just accidental mistakes at times, but folks can be very angry about the ways in which they themselves or their community has been treated. And language becomes one of the first indicators on, is this person who really, is this a person or organization that really like rocks with me? And I think we've seen that a lot, right, in the disability space, where if we notice this is an organization that uses special needs language, that's going to tell us something, versus an organization that uses like people first language or identity first language. All of those are very direct messages about, are we going to get along? Nonetheless, do some work together. So I think I just want to recognize that, because, I don't want people to lose sight of where we're ultimately trying to go. And I think that it becomes very important for us to examine the ways in which we introduce each other. So I can say my personal preference. My personal preference is that I use either people first language or identity first language. I identify as a Black disabled woman. I identify as a person with a disability. Things to that nature are what resonates with me. I don't, really get into like special needs language or differently abled. Like, that's just not something that personally resonates with me. And a lot of that just came down to the connection to the community, being in connection to organizations such as the one that y'all are with, and a multitude of groups, and just like feeling that sense of empowerment of claiming the word disability, when a lot of society still very much shies away from it or completely tries to sidestep it, if I can say it that way. So that's the language that I use. And I think that question is actually pretty large when it comes to the implications of how do we, really get to know each other in a way that hopefully the introduction doesn't break the relationship before it even starts.
So do you think the best strategy then for people is to get that out of the way right when they start engaging with another person or an organization? Is just to say, how do you prefer to be referred to? Or is that kind of what you think the best practice would be?
That's definitely one of the techniques that becomes really helpful. You're seeing a lot of, standard practices around introduction. So how people are saying, when we started the call, being able to say, what are your pronouns? Describe yourself, how do you identify? Like, if we can do that more often, it generally helps people to see where people are at and how to approach them and what they're willing to say and what they're not willing to say. Like, all of those things super help. And so the more that we can, ask people and put that into our standard practices, I think that becomes very helpful. And I'm also thinking about the times when it's tricky, where we might not be in a formal setting, and we're still trying to have that introduction, but there's no like facilitator to be able to say like who we all are. And I think in those cases, it's really about, just the conversation, right? Like being able to walk up to someone and engage in whatever is the reason that y'all are there, and finding ways to get to know people, right? Finding ways for them to tell you and them to describe. Are they going to get deeper into their identity? Are they not? Are they going to describe who they are? Like, the more that we are unafraid to, I think, approach people in cultures that we may or may not belong a part of, and be able to ask those questions that allow people to tell us, versus us, trying to be leading about some of the ways in which we may help people identify. I think that can help a lot.
That's great feedback. And what do you think, let's say that somebody lets me know that I have offended them or referred to them in a way that they weren't comfortable with, and they tell me that. How would you advise someone in that situation is the best way to respond?
The person who's offended, or the person who did the offending?
The person who did the offending.
Yeah. I mean, again, it kind of depends on the circumstance. So say this is an example where someone referred to, a person as differently abled, and they're like, nope, that ain't gonna work for me. I'm not with that. In the circumstances like that, I think it becomes really important for us to be able to humble ourselves and recognize the fact that people identify in a wide variety of ways. right? And we could flip that example even and say it the opposite. In our community, most people are more so identifying as a person with a disability, different our identity first language. And there's a ton of people who do not, right? And
Mhm.
so I think that is important for, as we're having this introduction, the introduction is not a point in time where you're trying to convince someone, here's how you should be identifying. Here's
Right.
what I think is what's appropriate. The introduction is literally someone telling you who they are.
Mhm.
And we need to be in a place where we can accept that, where we can say, okay, great, thanks for letting me know. It is very, very helpful when you're able to humble yourself and apologize and say, hey, I did not mean to offend you. I really hope we
Mhm.
can move forward. Like, those are things that we don't want to be dismissive. We don't want to, get ourselves in situations where you're like, this isn't even worth my time. All of those things can come up depending on the circumstance. And so I think it's very helpful when something like that occurs, that we receive it, and then we ideally allow ourselves to deepen the relationships, to understand more and figure out how exactly we are supporting each other in whatever way that may mean.
Well, you didn't mention this in your intro, but one of the awesome things that you've done is you founded the National Alliance of Multicultural Disabled Advocates, which you describe as a network of organizers across the country who invest in the livelihood and leadership of Black and Brown people with disabilities. And I just love that. So, could you tell us more about that group and how listeners can get involved?
Yeah. So, as you mentioned, it's the National Alliance of Multicultural Disabled Advocates, and we go by the named advocates. It's a play on the word named, just missing the E, but that's how we do it. And we really formed a couple of years ago with this desire of creating more space to be able to understand and advocate for the experiences of people with disabilities who are also people of color. And that became incredibly important because one of the things that we know is that people experience life differently. So we know at this point in time that the experiences of women can look different from the experiences of men. The experiences from a cis heteronormative person can look very different from a trans LGBTQ person. Like, our experiences just look different based on our identity, based on societal systems, all of those different types of things. And so it became very evident that in the disability community and the disability industry, that a lot of the advocacy is focused on the experiences of white disabled folks. And we needed to create more space where we're centering the experiences of Black and Brown people and people of color. That becomes important. I mentioned voting earlier, where we just came out of an incredibly important election year, and we found that a lot of disability organizations were advocating for voter accessibility, which is very, very important. We definitely need more accessibility in our voting systems and process. But if you look at what's happening in communities of color, then they are having conversations that are centering voter suppression. And we need more spaces where we can intersect the two, where we can talk about what's happening in communities of color and also looking at the disability experience. And you can literally go down the list, right? You can look at our medical systems, you can look at our educational systems, you can look at a wide variety of things and see what is the emphasis of how this is impacting people of color. So our organization formulated because we knew we needed more space. We needed to be able to talk and create and to build in a way that makes sense for us. And we also needed to send a clear message to organizations that have not created space, that have not invested in communities of color, to say there's more that needs to be done here. And, being a part of that privilege, being a part of that issue where we're leaving people behind, that's just not going to work moving forward. So I'm really humbled and just, very proud of the space that we've been able to create through the Named Advocates, where we were looking last year of celebrating the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And we wanted to examine the ADA from the perspective of people of color. What does accessibility look like for us? Who are the people who we need to honor and mention and name? And what does that look like when it comes to what was happening with the uprising this past summer? All of those different things. So our space has been doing a lot to invest in people of color with disabilities who are creating, who are doing a lot of social, political, and economic impact in their communities, and ensuring that they have the tools, the resources, and the network that they need in order to generate that impact. So I want to encourage folks to get involved with us. As you mentioned, you can hop on our website. The website is withkeri.com. So that's WITHKERI.com, and you'll see a tab that says the Named Advocates. So you can follow our work. You can join our email list, because we will be launching some programs come this fall, and ways for folks to be a part of this organization. So if that's something that is of interest to you, if you're committed to the intersections of racial justice and disability justice, identify as a person of color with disabilities, then we really would love to see you be a part of this work.
So you mentioned voting, and one of the things that you are known for is your work with AAPD's voting initiatives, and particularly the Rev Up campaign. So what are some of the biggest voting barriers that face people with disabilities, and what, from your point of view, can be done to eliminate them, or what can, the average person be doing to make an impact, to break down those barriers?
Yeah. Voting this past year was a lot for so many reasons. Tons of candidates, tons of, tons of different things. And one of the things that we found is that we were dealing with some of our typical issues that we experience in elections, where there are ADA requirements to how the voting process goes, right? So in the sense of being able to physically access locations, being able to have alternate versions of ballots, so that if you are blind, if you are if you may not have access to using, to being able to mark a ballot physically, like all different types of things, we are still, and we have to assess every single city and every voting location. So it is a big undertaking and process that every year we are pushing for better results in. Clearly, this past year, we were also voting in the midst of a pandemic, and that created a lot of barriers. I mean, we saw the shutting down of many different voting locations. We saw the ramping up of potential electronic options, and it was happening very rapidly, and the communication was just not coming through quick enough or strong enough. And that created a lot of additional barriers to ensuring that people could vote at all, to ensuring that people were actually registered, to ensuring that people could show up, like people were showing up the day of and were not, like they didn't have the information that they need to successfully vote. And so we're looking at what happened in the primaries, we're looking at what happened leading up to November, a lot of concerns around the accessibility to a security to suppression. I think as we are reflecting on particularly this past year, a couple of areas that we need to really lean into is focusing on, we're still finding what is the best options to ensure the full accessible ballot. Since we did ramp up some of the electronic options for voting this year, and we're kind of sort of heading out of the pandemic, now states are questioning, should we shut those electronic options down? What is that going to do for the accessibility of our community? What is that going to do in terms of security? It's a lot of questions that we're still needing to address as we are having local elections and as we are leading into the midterms. We still are having issues with particular voting centers being shut down that are in predominantly Black and Brown communities. So looking at the disparities between if you're living in a more white dominated, especially middle class community, and the amount of access that you might have to vote, the amount of communication that you may receive, the amount of options can look very drastically different when you're in more predominantly Black and Brown communities. So those disparities in terms of like suppression, in terms of how we are ensuring that people have what they need, like all of that still very much exists. And I think the thing that can be confusing to folks at times is that we had record voting turnout, right? Which was incredible. A lot of work went behind making sure that as many people voted as we saw this past year. So that's incredible. And I think that speaks to not the fact that there were not issues. I think it spoke to the fact that people were committed to voting and fighting those barriers as much as they possibly could, because this election was just, it was big. It was important that people knew who that they were voting for. But still, even in the midst of a large voter turnout, that does not mean that there were too many barriers that existed that should not be continuing into future years. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. There's policies that still need to be clarified. There is a pace to this that needs to be picked up. And it becomes incredibly important that our advocacy groups are in a good communication with our election officials. So I think the more that we can see that relationship, so that we are ensuring that we're telling people what the problem is and what we need to be done differently, that's going to make a difference.
Well, so I want to get back a little bit to your consulting business, the Keri Gray Group, right? And you coach companies and organizations on leveraging intersectionality as an organizational practice. And I don't want to ask you to give too much away for free, but I was wondering if you could share 1 or 2 tips for organizations to be able to better reach disabled folks across communities of color.
Yeah. One of the foundational things that we need organizations and individuals to be working on is their communication tools, because we found that there are a lot of it's very, very common for leadership in particular. So your executives, your CEO, your boards to not engage in explicit conversations around race. And I think that goes back to the conversation that we were having earlier around the introduction, right? Like the introduction of topics can be very intimidating for folks, and there's a lot of reasons that they sidestep it. And so we found that like leadership not having explicit conversations around race infects the entire organization, and particularly your young professionals or your new employees who are like, okay, so we just saw that, you know, not too long ago, we celebrated the 1-year death of George Floyd. And it's a big thing. It's a really big thing that folks need to name and to remember and to hold and to show that this is something that like racism is real, along with ableism being real too. Like both of these things very much exist. And so if we see that organizations can have conversations about disability, but they cannot have conversations about race, that's an issue. And so one of the things that we describe in our work is communication is a skill set, right? Like if I'm say if for instance, I'm not a man, I'll use that as an example, right? So I'm a Black woman, and I need to start having conversations around I'll use our legal system as an example. So the incarceration of people of color with disabilities, particularly Black people with disabilities, but it can be challenging to do that because I did not personally have that experience. That has not been my main demographic that I'm a part of. So like, I don't know what to do with it, as an example, right? And so we teach people, like, what is the language that you need to know? What are the experiences that people are having? And how do we get folks to, at the very minimal, be able to have conversations around race in the workplace as part of their advocacy, right? And I think as disability advocates, we understand that a lot, right? Because we are constantly grappling with people to be able to say the word disability, to be able to understand that ableism is happening, that people are experiencing discrimination because of their disabilities, and this needs to be recognized and addressed. And if we're not having government, if we are not having companies, if we're not having organizations talk about disability, then we're not getting to the point where we can really grow. And so the foundation of it is like getting folks to be able to put this a part of their organizational culture. Then there's many steps from there, right? There's so many steps of, why aren't we reaching more people of color? Why are we not attracting candidates? Why are we not getting clients or, folks in our community who leverage our services? Why are we not building relationships with racial justice organizations? I think those are some of the questions that folks end up having. And so we go through a process of being able to assess, kind of what's going on in the organization in a very honest manner. And then we look at, here's what we can do. Here's ways in which we can expand our avenues and our language, our advocacy, the space that we hold, our practices and policies. All of those things become, tools and pieces in order to better diversify our workplace. And so that is thankfully something that I'm seeing a lot of disability organizations in particular, disability ERG, BRGs look at, of like, how can we do more to ensure that we are not just creating, spaces for white disabled folks, but like genuinely it is for, when we say all disabled people, we mean all disabled people. So yeah, that's a bit about it.
I love that. So as you mentioned, you acquired your disability as a young child. So I was wondering, when did you learn about the ADA, and how has the ADA impacted your life?
I feel like it's one of those things where you kind of hear the ADA from a young age. Like, people will say things like, oh, well, you could get some type of accommodation, but I just didn't, I'm a kid, right? I'm a kid who did not openly identify as being a person with a disability. So it kind of like went over the head, and I was like, okay. But again, I think that when I got in college and I started to be amongst my community in a very social aspect, and social, not just in the sense of making friends, but like hearing about our history, hearing about like there's disability culture, hearing that, there are key, advocacies, there are, there's so much when it comes to being a person with a disability and being a part of this like world. And that's, I think, when I started to be able to take a look at, okay, so what is the ADA? So this is important. This is something that ensures that we have the legal right to back up our needs and our demands. So it's no longer like this question of, well, I would like to be able to ensure that I have access to accessibility, but it's more so like, I deserve accessibility and it is my legal and human right to have it. And so I think it was, everything for me has been like a journey and a process. Like, I'm taking that in, I'm studying and I'm examining it. But I think it's when I entered into the workplace that I really started to see, so what are the implications behind this? So I'm entering into the workplace, and my background has often been running programs for young professionals. And the hustle is real when you are young, trying to enter into the workplace. there's already just a multitude of questions of like, what do I want to do with my life? And, am I passionate about this? Who should I work for? How do I apply for jobs properly? Like, there's already all of these like standard questions that everyone has. But then it's another level when you start to think about your identity. How am I going to exist in the workplace as a person with a disability? What does it look like for me if I'm a wheelchair user and like all of these offices have like literally still I'm based in the Washington, D.C. area, and there are certain places that are still protected to not have to be accessible for now. They might have to wait like another 10 years before they become accessible. You see that on college campuses and a lot of different places. And it begins to limit your opportunities to get a job, and it begins to have you question, who can I work for that's going to take in consideration that I have hearing loss? Who can I work for that's going to take consideration that I may have an attention disability, and there's certain accommodations that I can use in order to really focus? I think those questions become really scary. And there's a whole lot we can unpack just in that. But what I will say is what becomes very important is for people to know that the ADA exists, so that as they are, navigating everything from the interview process to the, working in an organization or a company to advancing nonetheless, that that one of the barriers that you should not experience is discrimination because of your disability. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people still don't know that. And even when you do, it's a struggle because, like, to speak out on it, to be able to name and say out loud to somebody, like, I'm not getting the access needs that the access that I need in order to be successful. And I know I can do this job. There was a reason that I'm hired. There's a reason that you interviewed me, right? All of those things, but I'm missing something in the process. And so I think the ADA has become fundamental for a lot of folks and a lot of people in our community to be able to get those various types of opportunities that they're looking for and to maintain them. We still got a long ways to go. I will say that.
Mm-hmm. And what is your hope for the future of accessibility in the ADA?
For me, there again, I think a number of needs, but what I will say, I think in terms of the future of the ADA, and I think the disability movement is the future is intersectional, right? So we're getting to a point where we are examining the policies and the practices that are happening within our systems and within our organizations, and making sure that they are centering those who are most impacted, right? And so if we're looking at the experience of disability, once again, we're not just looking at the different types of disabilities that people have, but we are also looking at the intersections of the disability experience. So particularly looking at the intersection of how are Black folks experiencing disability in a wide variety of ways? How's the Latinx community? How is the Asian community? Like, on and on, trying to figure out, like, if we can look at the experiences of those most impacted, then our policies and practices will only be stronger versus the cracks that we continue to see, or the wide gaps even that we continue to see. So once we are getting past that standard of hierarchy when it comes to experiences, we'll do a lot better with our policies and practices. And honestly, I think it goes to the, how can our organizations and the policies and practices intentionally invest back into the community? So we want to have protections in terms of like legal rights, but people need resources. People need opportunities to create. People need to be able to say, like, I'm building a center that is for my community and I know how to do this, but all of the funding has gone to everybody but the disability community, and particularly to disabled people of color. And so we need that investment of resources to back up our rights, to be able to say, like, you deserve space, you deserve opportunity, all of those things. Now we need folks who are saying, I'm willing to help build to make sure that our people have it, but I need those resources. So I think the combination of making sure that our policies and practices are intersectional, that the future of our movement is intersectional, along with the investment in our community, is going to do us a world of good.
Really well said. So you mentioned love earlier on in our discussion, and when I researched you, you definitely come up as having a theme of self-love and self-acceptance. So I was wondering, what would you say to listeners who are on that journey themselves and are maybe feeling a little defeated or are struggling with that self-love and self-acceptance? What advice could you give to those listeners?
There's something about when we can pause the conversation around policy and practices and the system, and like hone in on like that individual need to embrace yourself. Like that is part of like the introduction. That is part of the first steps. And I mentioned earlier that it took me a long time. It took me a long time, over 10 years, to even get to the point where I would recognize the disability side of myself. So one of the things that I want people to do in the midst of this journey is to, not think that you like, there's so many reasons to be hard on yourself. But one, I want folks to recognize that this is it, like this is part of it, right? This is the journey, this is the process, these are the steps. The second thing that I want people to do is to choose yourself. And I know that can sound like a very selfish statement. Don't take that literally in every step of your life. But in the context of this conversation, I really want folks to choose themselves. I say that because, there's a lot of reasons of why we do not identify, why we reject certain aspects of ourselves, such as being a person with a disability. And those are real, right? Like we've seen the violence that people have experienced. We've seen the othering that people have experienced. And it's hard to witness. At the same time, I think for me, I had to wake up at one point and say, I am tired of covering up who I am for the hope of acceptance of other people, right? Like that was just my journey. I was wearing long pants every single day. I wasn't talking about my disability. I was, covering up to the best of my abilities because I didn't want people to think that, this prosthetic, or like they would be uncomfortable with me. It would make this confusion of our relationships. Like I was doing as much as I could to cover up for the hope of acceptance. And I think the reality is that you are going to have people in your life who will love you, who will embrace you, and who will rock with you no matter what's happening with your body, with your mind, with your experiences. And you will also have people in your life who will always be uncomfortable with you, right? And so I think that the best choice that we can make is to say, who am I as a person, and how can I lean deeper into that? How can I love who I am and allow people to love me for that version of myself versus someone that that's not even me. But like, I think that people will like that version of me. So I think it becomes so important to be on that journey of discovery. Play with it. Play with your style. I remember for me, I started wearing shorts and skirts and discovering it through that sense of style. You can start playing with it in terms of the conversations that you're a part of, listening to the podcast, going to the events, and just trying to figure out like, who am I and where do I fit in this world? And those things are meaningful. Those things allow you to protect yourself, to love yourself, to embrace yourself, nonetheless, what that can do for a whole community of people. So I think with that question, I just want to acknowledge that the journey is real, but you're worth it. When you come on the other side, I just speaking from my personal experience, it is worth it.
That's beautiful. Well, Keri, I want to ask where listeners can get in touch with you and learn more about you. But before I do that, is there anything I didn't ask you or that you want to say to listeners today or mention, talk about before we wrap up?
The only thing that I would encourage folks to do is kind of piggying off on that self-love journey is I would also say find where you can get involved, right? Like if you're not already, some of us are involved in a million things, but if you're not already, I want to encourage people to be on that journey of self-discovery, but also be on the journey with community. Right? Like the biggest impact that you can have is when you surround yourself with a room full of folks and you're collectively, helping each other, supporting each other. We know that in movement work is possible because of partnerships. Movement work is possible because of the volunteers in the room. And there's so many different folks that are willing to say, like, we're going to do this together. We're going to do this collectively. And I want to say our movement needs you. And there's so many different ways to be a part of it. So I just want to encourage folks in the midst of your individual journey to find where you fit, where you can support amongst a group of people. Your day job, your side hustle, your community work. Again, there's tons of options, but we really could use you in the midst of this work. In terms of where to find me, folks can find me on social media. I am on Twitter, Keri_Gray, KERI_GRAY. I'm on Instagram, Keri Gray 90. And you can find me on LinkedIn. But my biggest thing is I want to encourage you to sign up for our newsletter. So if you go to my website, withkeri.com, withkeri.com. You'll see a button on your top right screen that says join our email list. That is where we're going to be sending resources towards people's way. We'll be sending a monthly newsletter that talks about what's happening in terms of this world of intersectionality, in terms of racial justice and disability justice. How can I interact with this? What do I do with this information? And then leading into the fall and to the next year, we will be hosting events and sessions and finding ways for people to join the named advocates on a deeper level. So I want to encourage people to join and hopefully we engage more.
Awesome. Well, we will put all those links in our show notes for listeners. And I just want to say thanks again, Keri, for your time today. This has been a great conversation.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Adventures in Accessibility. Tune in next time for another dive into the unknown.
Adventures in Accessibility is hosted and produced by Emily Schumann, and our sound engineer is Jessica Lucania. This podcast is a project of the Rocky Mountain ADA Center and is funded under a grant from the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. Grant number 90DP0094-01-00. This production is intended solely for entertainment and informal guidance and should not be considered legal advice. The opinions expressed by guests are not necessarily held or endorsed by the Rocky Mountain ADA Center.